apologize to the Bnei Chabura. My email account was not operational last night and today. So technical issues prevented me from sending the usual MEVARCHIM by email. I apologize. Everyone should have a copy in front of them, and Shlomo will try and arrange for the MEVARCHIM to be sent out. In the sugya of Dvarim haboim b'soich hasuda, we encounter at the very beginning of the sugya a fundamental machlokes Rashi and Tosfos, which goes to the heart of understanding the din of Dvarim haboim b'soich hasuda are not town bracha lifneim. In this limud, we won't focus on bracha lachreim, we'll focus primarily on bracha lifneim. So just to review briefly the lashon of the Gemara, page 14 in the MEVARCHIM book, and you can follow the sequence of the shir on the first page of the MEVARCHIM. At the end of each line, there's written a number, and the number, as we often do, corresponds to pages in the MEVARCHIM book. The Maskonos HaGemara, and that's the way the Rishonim Paskin follows Rav Papa. Omer Rav Papa Hilchasa, Dvarim haboim machmas hasuda b'soich hasuda ein tunim bracha loy lifneim v'loy lachreim v'shaloi machmas hasuda b'soich hasuda tu'unim bracha lifneim ve'ein tu'unim bracha lachreim. Rashi dibra maschil dvarim haboim machmas hasuda. So Rashi classifies that the din of dvarim haboim machmas hasuda is lelafes bohenes apas. Lelafes bohenes apas means miloshen lifton, mentions something that's eaten in accompaniment to the pas. Rashi therefore says, what's the reason why they're not torn bracha lifneim? Dahavu luhu tfela, because lifton is toffel to the pas. Hilkach says Rashi kol midei bein mozain bein peiros shehiviu lelifton. The second din of Rashi, that peiros can also be brought lelifton. We won't discuss in this limud. We'll discuss it next week's limud when we learn HaRav the sugya of peiros that abba b'soich hasuda. Ein by bracha lo lefonav lo la'achrav. So Rashi tells us two things. Firstly, that the din of dvarim haboim machmas hasuda is describing something that is there to be malafis, specifically the pas. It's an accompaniment to the pas. And a cursory reading of Rashi, when Rashi says that they don't require bracha lefonav, is because of the general principle of tafel and ikar. Then Rashi continues, Shaloi machmas hasuda b'soich hasuda, kigoin daisa, v'chein kruv, vegetables, trodin, she'enom lifton. So Rashi says that what comes in the suda b'toich hasuda, even though it's daisa, and daisa we know from the previous sugya and daf lamed vav, daisa is a tabshel made out of chameshes haminim, and even though that has a barim and a mezainis, which means it has the capacity to be mozain, it nourishes. Nonetheless, since Rashi says einon lifton, it doesn't accompany the pas. We remember the Gemara on Daf Lamed Vav, Hani bavloi tipshoi the ochli nahama b'nahama, that the bavli are tipshoi, that they eat daisa with pas, which the Gemara calls ochli nahama b'nahama. So the Gemara is a Gemara mefureshes that daisa is not eaten as lifton. Kruv and trodin, Rashi also doesn't seem to consider as lifton. And Rashi says, however, they are bo'im lemozoin v'lesoiva. Rashi again emphasizes that even though daisa and kruv and trodim are bo'im lemozoin v'lesoiva, nonetheless, tunim bracha lifneim, says Rashi, the lav tfeilon inhu, they're not tofel, ve'enom b'chlallechem, the niftar b'birchas hamoitzi. They shouldn't be considered included in the lechem, so that they should become potter with the bracha of hamoitzi. So seemingly Rashi, and we'll see Kipshutai Tesis understood Rashi that way, that the sugya of dvarim haboim b'soich hasuda, machmas hasuda, and shloi machmas hasuda, is simply a way of reiterating the dinim of bracha of tafel and ikar. And something that's ba machmas hasuda really means, because the ikar suda is kori al shem hapas. So memela machmas hasuda is another way of saying machmas hapas. Dvarim haboim shaloi machmas hasuda means, like Rashi says, she'enon lifton, they're not boim machmas hapas. So the mozoin and the soiva doesn't seem to play a role according to Rashi. It's merely if it's coming as lifton for pass. And the svara Rashi seems to repeat twice is because of the din of tfelus. Rashi says in the case of why they're not ton bracha, where they are bo machmas asuda, Rashi says the havelu tfela. And in the case where they do need the bracha, Rashi says the lav tfelon ninhu ve'inon b'chlal lechem to niftar b'birchas hamaitzi. Tosfos Afanart Dibra Maskal Hilchasa asks on Rashi, and he says, "V'loi nehira," third line of Tosfos, "to imkein masnisinhi." Why do we need Rav Papa to make this statement? It's a Mishnah. The mevarach ala ikur upoiter es atfela. There's a general principle in brachas that what makes a bracha on an ikar, and that patters the tofel. Umay kamash malon. What's the chiddush? Then Tosfos asks a second question. V'oid kosher the parach b'samach. The Gemara asks, "Yayin nami nifterei pas." Why doesn't yayin also become included in the bracha of the pas? Frek Tosfos umay kosher. V'haloi kisheshoisim hayayin einot feila la pas. Yayin is not tofel to pass. So we see that the Gemara wanted to extend the principle of dvar maboim b'achas suda b'teichas suda to something which doesn't have tfelus to pass. Now here, and we'll return to this nekuda, we can ask a basic question. Tosfos down the Amud, Yehochi yayin nami nifterei pas, the very last Tosfos on the Amud, discusses what the din is of mashkim that are consumed during the Suda besides for yayin. So Zok Tosfos, if we look in the last three lines of Tosfos, the line begins with the word mashkin, umiu oimer rabbeinu tam. The b'shar mashkim kegoin mayim v'sheichar. Mayim and sheichar that are boy machmas asuda pas poitrosan. Those certainly are included in the bracha of the pas. Why? Because the Gemara's maskana is that afilu yayin, even wine, have a poiter ilab the kaveh bracha la'atzmai. It's only the chashibas of yayin that distinguishes it in terms of its own bracha, that therefore excludes it from the bracha pras. But all other mashkim that don't have shani yayin, the goyim bracha la'atzmai, therefore they should be included in the bracha of the yayin. And Tosfos says, Deloi kamachzer vitri, not like what's brought in the Sefer Machzer Vitri, a Talmud of Rashi, shekosav shem mevarchim lamayim brocha bekol pam v'pam v'afilu b'seich hasuda. Two chidushim in the Machzer Vitri. Number one, that you have to make a bracha, and secondly, you have to make a bracha each time you drink. So we have a machlokes harishonim, what the din is of mashkim that are boim b'seich hasuda besides yain. Yain, of course, in Maskonos HaGemara is that's mechai b'beri priagofen. The shayla is what's rishar mashkim. The question is, do we know Rashi Shita on this din? What's Rashi Shita? The Machzer Vitri, we said, is a Talmud of Rashi, who says that you do have to make a bracha. He said it on Mayim. When we learn this Sugya Beis Hashem V'Hemshech, we see that our Rishonim that differentiate between Mayim and Shar Mashkim. But the Rashba in Chidushim on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph, you can see it in the Maramakomis booklet on page 73, brings B'Shem Rashi that Rashi agrees to Rabbeinu Tam, that all mashkim that are boim b'soich hasuda are included in the bracha of the pas. So not just does Tosfos have a right to ask from the Havamina of the Gemara that we see that yayin should have been included in the bracha of pas, but Rashi halacha lemaisa paskins that all other mashkim that are not included in the svar of the Gemara, that shani yayin, that's kaveh bracha la'atzmai, the goyim bracha la'atzmai, is included. So Tosfos has a kasha l'chur on Rashi halacha lemaisa. How is it possible that shar mashkim become included in the bracha of the pas? We have Tosfos kasha, but that if we go back to Tosfos lashon, maybe
that's not make it go down.
So the Rashba in Chanami, we're going to see the lashon of the Rashba. That the Rashba has a lashon later, which we'll see if other Rishonim hold. That the lashon of the Rashba is shamayim tfela la pas delishroi siba, coming to be sheira the pas. Now, if that's true, then that would be an answer to Tosfos kasha by yayin also. Because yayin also the Rishonim say be'etzim can be shayre, just it's kevei bracha la'atzmai. So we'll come back Beis Hashem to this point. But we see that the MS Tosfos kasha isn't just a kasha on the Havamina of a Gemara. Will have to be miyashav Tosfos kasha the dina, according to Rashi, that Rashi seems to include things that are not absolute lift onto the past, and we'll have to understand what lishroi ba and what kind of tefillos that creates. That's Tosfos next kasha that Tosfos asks on Rashi. Then Tosfos asks of Oid Kosher, last of the narrow lines, Mashapirish Rashi Dvar Maboim Shaloi Machmas Asuda, Betoich Asuda Kun Daisa Trodin Kruv She'enom Shalifton are not eaten together with the past. Uboim Lozen Vilizboya to Unim Brocha Lifneim the Lavt Feileninu. Zok Tosfos Veloini here, a second to the wide lines. The Amrinom Bamasnisim Birach Alapas Potter Saparperes. The Mishnah says later on that if a person makes a bracha on pas, then it patters the parperes. Uba Gemara mafarish duhu midin duadin kol ma'isa kedera. That any ma'isa kedera that's brought in the suda is included in the pas. That is shitas. Those shitas Rashi with the three kashas, essential kashas that Tosfos asks. First of all, according to Rashi, the sugya is not more than the din of ikir pattering tofel. Secondly, according to Rashi, what's the shakla v'tara of the Gemara about yayin? Yayin is not a lift on for pass. And thirdly, how can Rashi say, as an example, that dvarim shalom machmas asuda is daisa kruven trodim? Those should be ma'isa kedera and memela are included in the din of bir chalapas poter saparperes. So let's summarize briefly the ikar shitas rishonim to be miyashiv Rashi. Two of which we'll discuss Be'ez Hashem in this limud. The third, Shitas Rabbeinu Yoina, we'll discuss in a further limud bli neder. And what we'll try and look for in Shitas Rashi means, what is this concept of Ikar and Tofel that Rashi is speaking about? Clearly from Tosfos' kasha, it can't be just the repeat of the din of Ikar and Tofel of the Mishnah later on, because that Tosfos says is a Mishnah. We don't need the memor of Rav Papa to be mechadash that lahaloch. So on the one hand, Rashi is clearly invoking the principle of Ikar and Tofel, but without it being automatically included in the ordinary presentation of the din. So what we're going to look for in the Rishonim is how the Rishonim will create different scenarios, b'shitas Rashi, that ordinarily wouldn't be included in the din of Ikar and Tofel, yet they will be included in Rashi's Ikar and Tofel of our sugya, and then we'll try and understand why. Monavshach. If Rashi is a straightforward din of Ikar and Tofel, then why should there be exceptions? And if there are exceptions, then what's Rashi invoking from the din of Ikar and Tofel? And this will be critically important to understand Be'ez Hashem as we go further in the sugya, because we will see in Shitas HaTosfos that Rabbi Seinu Achronim be'ikad Mogen Avram and Pri Megadim established two basic ways of understanding the din of Dvar Maboim B'Seich HaSuda Machmas HaSuda, and we'll try and establish how Rashi is consistent or different than those two possibilities. The first two mahalchim we'll see are Mavur Mitoich the Rashba. The Rashba is on page 72 in the MEVARCHIM book. So the Rashba suggests two yishuvim for Shitas Rashi. Zok the Rashba, about 6 lines down from where the Rashba begins, the line beginning with Piskazu. Upiskazu kekule alma omra. Rav Papa. V'loi itzterichalei. The basic din of Rav Papa, that if something is coming to me malapis as a pass, we don't need Rav Papa actually to tell us why. De masnisinhi, like Tosfos asks, kol shu ikar v'yeshim v'itfeila mevarach ala ikar u'poiter satfeila. Keloimar bein betchila bein beseifa, whether brach rishona or brach achrona. Ela mishum inoch de ka'ozel v'koil nokat lahacha. Either there's a chiddush benegeh to the din of Paris, or says the Rashba, v'ina mi itztiri chalei k'tzas.
Can you put the marker on where the Rashba is? Because I'm having trouble finding it. You got to lower it down, then with the page down. Okay, it's in that paragraph, the 5th line, the 6th line?
Yeah, Piskazu, that's right.
Let's do that again.
Let's read it again. Upiskazu kekule alma omro of Papa. V'lo yitztiri chalei. The etzem din of when something is brought to be malachas as a pass, that's the poshta din of the Mishnah, like Tosfos asks on Rashi. So first the Rashba says, the chiddush is, inoch de ka'ozel v'koil noket lahacha. The chiddush is for a different case. The chiddush is for Paris. that sometimes Paris can be brought in the Suda also to be Malafis as a pass. What's the Chiddush? The Chiddush is, even though ordinarily Paris are not used as lifton, Kamash Malon. So that's the first possibility to be Miyashiv Rashi. We'll recall that as we read Rashi, we were Medayik, that an example of a Lafis Besampas, Rashi says, Bein Mozoin, Bein Paris. So Rashi agrees that there is an instance of Paris, which are ordinarily not eaten as a main course of the Suda, but can be eaten as lifton. So first the Rashba says, Einachanami. Perhaps the Ikka statement of Rav Papa of Boim B'Soicha Suda is not a Chiddush, because that's an ordinary din of Tafel. The Chiddush is there's an instance of Paris that can also be considered lifton. But what we'll focus on is the second Yishuv of the Rashba. V'inami. There's another Chiddush. Why? The Salka Daita Chamino Kevon she'in darkon lovoy v'lelafton uletaflo afagav dahai melafis buesapas botlo daitoy v'loy lifterei. There's a general Chiddush in Rashi that even if one brings something to the Suda that isn't derech lovoy lelifton uletaflo, and the person he himself wants to use it as a lifton and a tofel, afagav dahai melafis buesapas, we would have said botlo daitoy. We would, so the Rashba says it's a chiddush ktsas, and he says because we could have said botlo daitoi komash malon the kiven shein dar kon love lift on afagav the haim afis besapas botlo daitoi v'le lifter komash malon canal. Now, yesh listapik in the kavonas Rashba. Is this a universal din in ikar and tofel? If a person wants to make something on his own, a tofel, is the Rashba now establishing that we don't say botlo daitoi by all ikar and tofel? Or is this something unique to dvarim haboim b'soicha suda? L'chura, it's muchrach that it's a unique din to dvarim haboim b'soicha suda. Why? Because where did Rav Papa say his memra? He didn't say his memra on the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says kol she'eshimay ikar v'imoy tfeila. On that, Rav Papa would say, even though it's ein darke b'kach botlo daitoi, Rav Papa said this din dafke in the context of something that's bo l'lafes asapas. So we see that in l'lafes asapas, darkoi or ein darkoi is less of a concern than in ordinarily in the din of ikar and tofel. So if we summarize what's mavur in the Rashba, the Rashba is saying that when it comes to include something in a Suda as a lifton, we have less concern with the ordinary dinim of ikar and tofel, where we look at it as this is absolutely tofel to something else. And here, someone individually can establish that he wants to use this alafas as a pass, and we're not concerned with botla daitoi. Afagav the haim alafas was a pass, botla daitoi v'la lifteri. Now, what state in the Rashba? What's the understanding of this? Is the Rashba saying that somehow things become easier tofel to pass? Is the Rashba saying somehow that lifton is a greater tfelus than ordinary tofel? Ordinarily, tofel and ikar just means that one is mishamish the other, like something comes to be mematic, a dover that's moliach, and so on. Perhaps lifton is a stronger association between the ikar and the tofel. Is it something miyucha to pass? Or is it a suda dikadim? Correct. And this we'll see from the hemshech of the Rashba seems to be mostly the mashmos of the Rashba would seem to be that it's mavura a third tzad, which is that there's something called tfelus in a suda. Not because dafka pas is a greater ikar and therefore things become tofel easier. Not because lifton is a greater tfelus because it's necha, one to be mishamish the other, but because suda establishes a seder of brachas. Where's this mavur? This will be mavur in the Balamor. He says, Avalar zal tiritz. The Balamor says the following: the holder of Papa b'shaloy hoyu lefonov b'shoshe birich alapas. These were talking about a case where the dvarim haboim b'soicha suda were not in front of him when he made the bracha of on the pass. V'havei amino the tfeila loy miftira elo b'shahoisa lefonov meikara. Why? The daitoi ilavei beidno de barach hamoitzi. There'd be a havamina to say that we can only invoke the din of ikar and tofel if it was in front of him, because then his intention at the point where he's making the bracha of the ikar is to consume subsequently the tofel with the ikar. And therefore, the bracha made on the ikr applies to the tofel also. Kamash malon, kevon the tfeilon ninhu loy bo bracha. Because they're tofel, they don't require a bracha. Now, again, we have a shaila in the Balamor. Is the Balamor now telling us that the Havamina was not correct? And tofel doesn't depend on the fonov and das, but only depends on absolute ikr and tofel? Or is the Balamor saying something unique to a Suda? Zok firtais the Balamor. V'ho de ka'omar of Papa Dvarm haboim b'seicha Suda machmas Suda. V'loi ka'omar hadvoim haboim machmas Suda. The kevon de machmas Suda hainu sheboy l'lafes apsas pshita de b'toich Suda himboim. So zot the Balamor that the Papa said Dvarm haboim b'seicha Suda machmas Suda, and he didn't just say Dvarm haboim machmas Suda. Why b'seicha Suda? Zot the Rashba the kiven the machmas Suda hainu sheboy l'lafes is pas. If you always need the fact that the lafes is a pass, of course they're coming in the middle of the Suda. So they're nearly the lavla diuka noket leilahu lishna. And l'mshimhanich bovi achrine the itzterich lemisne bu besoicha suda lacha suda noka nami baho bekidei ulefirusha revicha ba'alma besoicha suda. Zot the einoch nami. The maskonas hadvarim is that the concept is that it's coming lelafes asapas. Besoicha suda is not relevant. And we'll see later on in Rabbeinu Yonah that lashon is critical, but the Rashba says the lashon is not the diuk. Lav le diuk anokat le. The principle remains the lapis bohem esapas. That's the yisod. That's the yisod. If you actually look in the lashon of the Balamor inside, this is on page 14 of the pages of the MEVARCHIM book. Yeah, sorry, page, I apologize. It's on page, I apologize. It's on page 55.
55.
Yeah, it's on page 55 in the MEVARCHIM booklet, almost at the bottom of the page, just below Rabbeinu Yonah, we have Hamor Akoton and two columns. So if we look at the lashon of the Balamor, we'll see the mashmos even a little clearer than we had in the Rashba. Zok the Balamor, vim toima ma'ika mashmalon. What's the chiddush of Papa? Masnisani, it's a Mishnah. Zeh klal kol shu ikr ve'imoy tefela mevarach ala ikru poiter satfela. Zok the Balamor tzricha. The imi masnisan havi amina. Hani mili bedover shebo im hapas. The chiborich arifto, when he made the bracha on the pass, havi daite ilavei nami. Aval hocha de beidna de borich birchas hamoitzi. Kati loy aisi kamei. It was not in front of him. Therefore, even though hanoch dvar maboy machmas suda veloy habe daite ilave b'shas bracha me oilam emali boy bracha mitchila. We should say it should need a bracha. Komash malon kiven the tfeilon ninhu loy boy bracha. This is the lashon of the Balamor. New terminology, correct. Mavur mitoich the Balamor. That the Yesod Hadvarim is that be'etzem the general klal of ikar v'imoy tfeila requires that it should be there b'shas habracha. Here, since this is a dover that's bo machmas the pass, so even though it doesn't necessarily have the significance of b'soich hasuda, the point is not because it's b'soich hasuda. The point is it's bo l'lafes hasapas. Where the chiddush of Papa is that whatever comes l'lafes hasapas is assumed within the achila of the pass, and it doesn't conform with the principles of ikra and tofel. Mivur in the Balamor that there is a separate there's a separate way in which pass is nechal, and pass has with it pass is nechal together with lifton. And the Mela pass automatically includes all of what is brought later, even if it wasn't the fonov, and even if there is no das, which ordinarily we need in the case of bracha and in ikra and tofel. Komash malon, whatever is brought subsequent to the pass is included within the achil of the pass, and therefore doesn't require a bracha. Let's make a further diuk in the lashon nifla of the Balamor. The Balamor began with the lashon that ordinarily, how does ikra and tofel work? Since it's in front of you, zot the Balamor, Daite ilavei b'shas bracha. When you make the bracha applies to the tofel. When the Balamor explains why we don't need a bracha for something that is bo b'seich hasuda, machnas hasuda, he says, "Kevon de tefela ninhu." What's the lashon? Loi bo'i bracha. It doesn't require a bracha. Mevur in the Balamor, again, another raya that this is not the ordinary din of ikar and tofel. Because ordinarily the din of ikar and tofel means that one's das is to apply the bracha to the tofel. In this case, says the Balamor, lifton doesn't require a bracha because it's included in the pass. And we'll recall from the sugya on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, we briefly touched on these study. Sofik of the Primigodim is generally the din of ikar and tofel, that the tofel doesn't require a bracha or it's included in the bracha. The Balamor clearly is mashba, and then we saw it's possibly it's a machlokes rishonim, that the way ikar and tofel works is that the tofel is included in the bracha. The Balamor then is being mechadish that in the case of lifton of pas, there is no requirement of a bracha. Mevur again in the Balamor that the chiddush of Papa is not the general principle of ikar and tofel, but that lifton to pass, dvarim aboim b'seich hasuda, are considered tofel to pass be'etzem, and therefore don't require a bracha b'chlal. Now, im keinim hadvarim, then we have possibly not a hechrach, but certainly a mashmos, to go back to the beginning of the Rashba, where the Rashba had said that there's an exception to the dinim of ikar and tofel, that even if the derech is not to use it as lifton, still we don't say botla daitoi. So we asked, is that a general klal in ikar and tofel? And is that dafka because pas is a greater ikar, or is it because lalafis is a greater tfelos? Or is there a third svara, as Rabbi said, that a seder, a suda has a seder? From the Balamor, we see that the din is not the ordinary din conforming to the klalim of bracha and tofel, of ikar and tofel, but whatever is brought b'soich hasuda as an addition to the pas, mele is included and it's potter because it's included in the seder of the chil of the pas. Therefore, we have a right to say in the Rashba that ordinarily, perhaps in the dinim of ikar and tofel, we have to establish what is ordinarily in ikar and tofel, and there may be a nidin of botla daitoi. But where something is brought lelafes, where lelafes means it's not mechuyev in bracha, but it's included in the seder achila of the pas, in that case, we no longer have to consider, would this ordinarily be brought as lifton? But since in this case it's being brought as lifton, memela it's nichal and achila sapas. So the ikar chiddush, the ikar nakuda which we're establishing from the Balamor and from the Rashba, is that, as we'll go on to see in the Achronim, the Achronim will suggest that Dvarim Aboim B'Soich Hasuda Machmas Hasuda are either included in the bracha of Pas, or that their achila is tofel to the achila sapas. From Rashi, we see a third sad, that there's something called the seder of a suda. Whatever is brought, and there's the continuation of the suda, is not ton bracha because it's automatically included in the initial seder of achila sapas. So now we'll come to be magdir. We'll come to be magdir in Rashi what the concept of tefilus is. Now, im keinim advarim, then we can come back to the shaila that we asked. That we said, Rashi's shita is, the Rashba says that mashkim, that aboim b'soich hasuda, are niftar in the bracha of the pas. So we asked, that comes out, the halacha, Tosfos has a kash on Rashi, that shar mashkim don't come lalafis as a pas. If we need a lifton to establish tefilus to pass, so how then are mashkim potter? So we saw the lashon of the Rashba, that since the mayim comes to be shoyre the pas, therefore it's considered a tofel. Lefid Vareinu Rashi, the Rashba means that because mashkim come to be shira past their tofel, it doesn't mean that because the other mashkim serve the pas therefore their tofel. It means since the seder of a suda is that la'achar achilas pas, that requires one lifton and two a mashka to be shira, so therefore the seder of the achila of pas includes in it lifton and mashke. If it includes in it lifton and mashke, then zot the balamor, they're potter from bracha. That's the beer in Shittas Rashi, that mashkim aboim b'soich hasuda are potter in the past, not because there's absolute dinim of ikar and tofel. That Tosfos asks that mashkim are not failing. We asked if every time mashkim come lishrois, then Tosfos doesn't have a kasha on Rashi. The answer is we can only use lishrois once we establish this chiddush of Rashi, that Rashi's tefillah doesn't mean the Mishnah's tofel. Rashi means there's an oifen of tofel where something is included in the seder achila of the ikr. And we said from the Balamor, the nafkamina will be to summarize that ikr and tofel means one has to include the tofel in one's bracha. Whereas in the case of saboyma boim b'soich hasuda, zot the Balamor, loy boy bracha. There's no requirement of bracha in the first place. So to summarize the point that we've reached to this point, Tosfos asked on Rashi that this is included in the din of ikr and tofel of the Mishnah. We see the Rishonim refer to this kasha. The Rashba says the nafkamina is that there's no din of batla daitoi, and the Balamor says it's even if it wasn't daitoi elave. The Yesod Advarim we said is one Yesod, which means that it's not the straightforward din of ikr and tofel, but it means all the achila and the seder of the suda is included in achila sapas, and therefore that's the explanation why the Fishitas Rashi mashkim are also included in the bracha of the pas, and lishrois doesn't have to be a tefilus. Otherwise, yain should also have that, and Tosfos wouldn't have a kasha. Lishrois means because that's part of what pas requires. Masha'enke in the svar of Rashi is that shar tavshilin, other forms of tavshil that don't necessarily have to accompany pas, like for example, daisa kruv and trodim, that doesn't have a din of tofel and ikr. Tosfos asked it should be included in the original bracha of the hamoitzi. So that Be'ez Hashem will see in the Magen Giborim a yishuv for that kasha of Rashi, but we can now lefi the Balamor, we can be miyashav the Shaila. Because according to the Balamor, Einochanami Rashi is moyeder that there's a din of bircha pas poter as a parperes, but that's only where one's das was to pater the parperes, because it's assumed that will be part of the Suda, it's lefonov. But where it's not lefonov, then Einochanami there will have to invoke the din of what the Balamor says, that whatever's included in the Seder Achila Pas doesn't need a bracha. That depends then if it's boim lafis sapas or loy boim lafis sapas. That would be the Pesach to be done in Shitas Rashi, and as we said, we'll come back to discuss this again in the Magen Giborim. But what's important for us to take from Shitas Rashi in the Sugya is that Lefi Shitas Rashi, we're not being mechadish the ordinary din of ikr and tofel, and we're not saying that the bracha of pas somehow includes everything else. What we're saying is that there's a seder of achilas hapas, and memela all else that accompanies the seder of achilas hapas in the lashon of Balamor loy boi bracha simply doesn't require a bracha. Tosfos maskana. We'll go back now to Tosfos on page 14. Tosfos maskana is to argue on Rashi, and Tosfos maskana is in the name of the Ri that dvarim haboim b'soich hasuda does not mean something which comes lafas hapas. It means keloimar haregilim lovoi machmas hasasuda b'pas. They would be ordinarily eaten in a formal meal of pas. Sheregilim la'oichlam ima pas kigoim basar v'dogim v'chol minei kedera. It doesn't mean they're eaten as lifton. They're not as an accompaniment to the pas, but they would ordinarily be a dish served at a pas meal, which means pas establishes a chashivus of tviyas suda, where it would be a suda that was nikvala pas. These kind of tafshilin would be brought. Yeah, so let's see. We'll see Be'ez Hashem in terms of Bizmanenu. We'll get to that Be'ez Hashem. But the Nikud of Tosfos says the kevon de mishum pasim boim, because they come because of the pas, hapas poitrosam. And what does Tosfos include in the list? Basar, dogim, v'chol minei kedera. Basar, dogim, v'chol minei kedera. The kevon de mishum pasim boim, hapas poitrosam. Now, the lashon of Tosfos is very sossum. Tosfos begins with saying, like we said before, haregilim lovoi machmas hasuda b'pas. They come at the choshev hasuda of pas. Then Tosfos says, sheregilim la'achlam ima pas. And then Tosfos says again, de mishum pasim boim. So the lashon of mishum pasim boim, we could say that because the suda is a suda chashuva, by dint of the fact, by virtue of the fact that it's being eaten a la pas, so therefore everything else is considered somehow machmas pas. But how do we explain the intermediate lashon of the Gemara that of Tosfos, what Tosfos says? Because mipnei sheregilim la'achlam im hapas. So this mevucha is discussed by the Beis Meir, and the Beis Meir discusses the following shaila. He says, let's say for example, someone is cooking meat, and together with the meat he cooks vegetables, where the primary purpose of the vegetables is in order to enhance the meat, rather than to be its own vegetable dish. Now, let's say a person makes a pot roast, and together with that, there's carrots and there's onions, there's potatoes, but the purpose is really to be eaten as a meat dish. What's the din of all those yerachos? So the Beis Meir is medayik in the Magen Avraham that the Magen Avraham seems to be mesupik in this shaila.
You may have to make a bracha on onions.
You may have to make a bracha on that. That's cooked together with the basa.
And in other words, did you wash? You had pas in the suda.
You had pas in the suda.
So you still have to make a bracha.
That's the nida. So if you look in the Beis Meir, we'll see his lashon briefly. The Beis Meir says the following. He says, if we look in the lashon of the mechaber, the Olam has, I imagine, reviewed the lashon of the mechaber during the limudim of this week. When the mechaber brings the din of dvar ma'boy machim sasuda, the lashon of the mechaber seems to be very misleading. The lashon of the mechaber is lelafis bohen tapas. If you turn to the Shulchan Aruch pages, we'll see on page 214 the lashon of the mechaber in the beginning of Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin. The lashon of the mechaber is dvar ma'boy b'soy chasuda. Imhim dvarim aboy machma suda dahainu dvarim shederech likvoya suuda aleim lelafes bohem esapas. So we have the lashon of derech likvoya suuda aleim ulelafes bohem esapas. So what is it? Bedafka? Lelafes bohem esapas? Is it lav dafka? So if you look in the Bir Halacha, opposite page 215. Second column of the Bir Halacha. So the Bir Halacha right away qualifies the lashon of the mechaber, and he says, "Ayin batoisves v'talmidei Rabbeinu Yonav Arosh duhu adin dvarim she'ein derech lafen esapas rak sheboim lemozoin v'lesoiva gam b'chlal dvarim haboim achmasuda v'hamechaber kitzer b'zeh." The mechaber was vague. Zok the Beis Meir, where's it muchach in Tosfos that Tosfos doesn't just mean things that come directly machmas hapas, but are things that come machmas the suda that's choshuv because of the pas. Zot der azay. But tzorachiyun lefizeh. Right? If we take the mechaber literally, zok the Beis Meir, and this is what you're saying, Reb Shlomo, loshen zeh atzmai muskar b'Tosfos. Well, tzorachiyun lefizeh b'chol minei lefes. Hein priha adama kegoin marivim mekayotzaboy vehin priha eitz goin agasim mekayotzaboyim shemevashlim im habosam. They're cooked together with meat. Shekol elu mine lefes ein darkum lefes ba'es hapas. They're being used to enhance a main dish, but they're not directly used to enhance lechem. How do we consider those? Zok der aval harashba shabes Yosef. If you look in the Rashba, Beis Yosef brings loy tola hatam b'hachi. He didn't say the reason was that elazel shoynoi. Aval bosar v'kayoytze shehem ba'atzma mozoin ve'enom boim likinuach suda. They don't come as an aperitif or as a dessert. El lahazbia. And the lashon of the Rashba is ve'hein ba'atzma minas suuda. Upas poiteres kol shebo limozoin ulahazbia. Pas patas everything that comes from mozen and for soiva. Umaise keder nami mahu taimo dafhein soya dumulahazbia boim. Zog the Rashba that the Yisoid Advarim is because pas poiteres kol bo limozoin ulahazbia. Now, we established in Shitas HaRashba, Al Derech Rashi and the Balamor, that the Yisoid Advarim is because that's Suda. So pas doesn't have the ordinary dinim of Ikur Tofel, that botlo daitoi, or it doesn't need to be daitoi or lave. And the svara is because it's loy boy bracha, because it's included in Suda. So in the Rashba, we understand very well that the poiter is that pas establishes a concept called Suda. She'ena Suda nikris el Hashem pas. Once we're in the realm of Suda, the din of Suda then says everything that belongs to the process of Suda. What does a person consume in a Suda? Something that's lamazon or lasbia. So the Fishitas HaRashba, it's nifla. That the Rashba is the Beis Meir says mufurish that the din of why all things, even if they're not lafes bas, are included, isn't because of a broadening of the concept of tafel, is because that's seder asuda. The Beis Meir then extends that and says, and this will be very important as when we see the Magen Avraham, the Beis Meir extends that to Shittas HaTosfos, and he says Tosfos fundamentally agrees with the svara of the Rashba. And therefore, Lidvarov, according to the Rashba, kol minei lefes hamizbashlim b'hadei basar, anything that's included in basar, lahazbiahim boim, they're eaten as part of the meat dish, v'nikroi machnas asuda, umidhabes yosef kosav, shedas ha-Rashba, chodom das ha-toises be'inyan zeh, the machnas asuda b'toich asuda, shma mino de dochak lefaresh, he was being madchik in the Lashon ha-toises. Note the Beis Meir says that this is somewhat forced in the Lashon ha-toises, shedochak avshitz ha-toises ketaimoi. See, he's pushing that into Taisus, even though Taisus seems to be mashma, that it also needs in some way to be related to the past. What's the raya? We said that there's a second machlokes between Rashi and Taisus about the din of daisa, if that's included in pas. Taisus says that's pas poiteres aparperes. Zok the Beis Meir. The Gemara we mentioned, Hanu Bavloi Tipshoi, Shmamidot Zulas Bavloi, without the Bavliim, Ein Midarkom Lalafes Boyas Apas. It's completely unrelated to Pas. So we see Mefurish and Taisus that if Taisus holds even Daisa is included in the Seder of the Suda, Vaistach anything that's Lamazon Lasbia and the Lafes Apas is Lab Dafka. Everything that's part of main course is included in the bracha, and we never look if this individually would be. So, for example, a dish that's popular, sometimes one cooks chicken or meat with apricots. Now, apricots are pears. But Zot the Beis Meir, since it's included in the meat dish, so certainly it's coming the Mozan or the Soiva. It's part of the Seder of the Suda. So, Poshet Zot the Beis Meir that I found in the Rashba, that's Mefurish. I found in the Beis Yosef that Taisus is like the Rashba, and I can prove from Taisus that certainly the key concept is not how closely it's associated with Pas, because Daisa is completely separate from Achilas Pas, and Taisus is Moida.
Who would argue?
That depends. Well, so that we can see clearly that the Bir Halacha is being nochis, that the Diktuk HaLashon Mechaber is not like that. And the simple reading of Taisus, as you started with Reb Shlomo, Lashon Ze'atzman was Kanami Bataisus. So what we would then take from the Beis Meir is that the svara, even in the Mechaber and Shittat HaTaisus, is that the Ptur of Dvar Maboy Machmas Asuda is not the general din of Ikran Tofel. It doesn't have to be that the bracha of Hamoitzi applies because the Balamor says Mefurish in a tone bracha. It doesn't need particular derech of Tfeilis because even Batla Daitoi. Now the Yesod Advarim is similar to my Mashkim, that mashkim also are considered tofel because they're part of the chelik of the Suda. So Bazoi, the Lashon of Tais is meduktek lahafli. Pas is goyrim, that I'm eating something that's lemazon ulasbia. Why? Because pas establishes a Suda chashuva. What's brought as part of a Suda chashuva? Things that are mazon ulasbia, memela, they're automatically included in the bracha made on the Suda.
Mother bracha of Suda is pas.
I'm sorry?
Mother bracha.
Okay, correct. The bracha for Suda is very well put. The bracha for Suda is pas. The bracha of Suda is pas, right?
Yeah, the word mother.
Mother, yes. It's yes. Yeah. Yeah, as in motherboard and yeah. So, yes. So this is the aside which l'chura we would take from the Rashba. Now, what's this negeh? This is negeh to a suffix of the Magen Avraham, which is possibly the most basic suffix in the halachas of Dvar Maboy Machmas Asuda. Let's learn together Be'ezer Hashem the Magen Avraham in the beginning of Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin. So that's on page 214 in the Marmakema's book, the Magen Avraham's din. Zok the Magen Avraham. V'lochein nirali. Now, we should really begin from the very first words of the Magen Avraham, because in the very first words of the Magen Avraham lies the very basis of the Magen Avraham suffix. Zok the Magen Avraham, why is something that's Bo B'Sei Chasuda not told in a bracha? What's the lashon of Magen Avraham? Tehein Tfeilim Lapas. Now here the Magen Avraham with these words, l'chura, completely changed the Havana and Sugya. Let's go back to the Shittas Rishonim. We began with Rashi, where Rashi introduced the Sugya of Tofel. Tosfos says Tofel's a Mishnah. Dvar Maboy Machasuda is a different din. We then said that Loi Meboya, Rashi doesn't literally mean Tofel, but Tosfos certainly doesn't mean the din of Tfeilos, and that the Beis Meir just proved from the Beis Yosef and put together Shitza Rashba, and it's nothing to do with the din of the general halach of Tfeilos. There's a din that the Seder of a Suda has a bracha. The Magen Avraham seems to understand not that way. The Magen Avraham's premise at the beginning of the Suda is the Tfeilim Lapas. Now, we could say all he means is to bring Shittas Rashi, where Rashi also invokes the concept of Tfeilos. But we'll see the Magen Avraham means much more. Zog the Magen Avraham, Lochein irli, tim ein chofetz lechel pas, v'oichel ma'at pas, u'mevarach olav hamoitzi, ein poiter hama'acholim. If one's ikar intention is not to eat bread, and one's eating a small amount of pas, meaning less than a shir kviyas suda, or not what that one, or the amount of pas one would ordinarily eat if the primary food in the suda is pas, zot the Magen Avraham, ein poiter hama'acholim. Elodafko bekoivea sudose ala pas amrinon to kola ma'acholim machmas hapasim boim. Aval keshe'ein chofetz lechol pas einoi poiter. V'kol shekenim oichel pochis mikazayis keinerli. Ve'ef shaloimar kemen the derech likvoya suda aleim hapas poitroson v'tzorachim. So the Magen Avraham on the one hand says that we need the kolama cholim machmas pasim boim, which is Lashon HaTosfos, and therefore kshe'enei chofetz lechol pas einoi poiter. On the other hand, he says no. Keven the derech likvoya sudos aleim hapas poitrosa. What's the suffix? The Magen Avraham began with tfeilos. Then the Magen Avraham brings the Lashon HaTosfos that they have to come machmas pas. So if the pas isn't the main part of the suda, then adarabba, the ikar is not the pas. We can't say machmas pasim boim where the ikar is not the pas. And then he says, on the other hand, no, derech likvoya sudos aleim pas poitroson. Since it is the derech, the pas patters. What are the tzadimi in the Magen Avraham? If there's tfeilus, then the chayra, it's totally on what's the ikar. So then the Magen Avraham is right. If the pas is not the ikar of the suda and was only eating a little, then it's not an ikar. If it's because it becomes a suda of pas, then maybe also if you're not being kaveh suda la pas, like Daniel said before, then in a chanam it's not the mother bracha for the suda because it's not the suda's pas. What are the tzadim of the Magen Avraham? So the Pri Megadim explains what the suffix of the Magen Avraham is. Dvar Niflaim in Pri Megadim. He says, Mokum HaSuffix. We'll begin on the fourth line of the Pri Megadim. The line begins with the words Afal Gav. It says, V'al Kain, Bosar v'dogim v'kadoime ham, the Agav pas boim. They are coming because it's a suda of pas. And even though Tosfos says, Afal Gav, the ein melafes pas, even though you're not actually eating it as lifton, Ikar, the pas is Ikar, v'heim tfeilim, v'kanira mi Tosfos dibur maschil hilchasa, Pri Megadim is medayik the Lashon HaTosfos, kiven de mishum pas boim, ha-pas poitrosom, mashma ha-pas tofel legabayu loy. We need the ordinary din of Ikar and Tofel. That is what the Pri Megadim says is mashma in the Lashon of Tosfos. Kiven de mishum pasim boim ha-pas poitrosom, mashma ha-pas tofel legabayu loy. If the pas adar will be tofel, no. Oh yesh loymar, no. The svara is if you go now down to the fifth line of the Pri Megadim, just because of time, we'll just summarize the Pri Megadim's iketut stadim. He says there's another way of understanding it. V'gam hamoitzi brocha chashuva mikol habrachos. Birchas hamoitzi is a bracha that's more chashuv than all the other brachas, and therefore umishum hachi pas efshe poite bekolshu lahanach basar dogim. Because all other things are considered inferior to pas, and therefore the bracha of pas automatically includes the bracha on all dvarim haboy machmas asuda. That's the tzarechim. In other words, what are the two tzadim in the Pri Megadim? Is the tzad doime to the sugya of Ikar and Tofel, or is it a new svara which we haven't had yet, and mashmos in the Rishonim, that somehow the bracha on pas becomes a bracha for everything else in the Suda? So far, which two tzadim did we have? We had in Tosfos understood Rashi, that's a general concept of Ikar and Tofel. Based on the Rashba, Balamoir, and now the Beis Meir, there's a concept of all that's included in the Suda. The Pri Megadim is medayik in the Magen Avraham, that the Magen Avraham's maskana is not that svara in the Rishonim, that there's a seder of Suda. But we're reverting to the din of Ikar and Tofel. And if we're reverting to the din of Iker and Tofel, then the svara should be it's only if the pas is Iker. That the Magen Avraham is being mechadish that maybe Tosfos meant something else. You know what boy machmas pas means? It means because pas is a bracha that's more choshev than all brachas, where everything comes together with a pas. There's a new din that since pas is the bracha yosech hashuva, and it subsumes all ma'acholim, so the bracha applies to everything. In which case, the Pri Megadim, the mere fact that I made the bracha of hamoitzi includes everything. It's a super bracha. So l'sikum hadvarim, we now have three basic ways to understand the sugya of Dharma Bo Mesech Suda. We began with Rashi of Iker and Tofel. We assumed that the Rishonim and Shittas Rashi were going away from that. We now have a Pri Megadim b'Shittas HaMagen Avraham that Lo Meboya Rashi meant that, but even Tosfos meant that. Just Tosfos said, how does something become Tofel to pass? As long as it is something that usually is used as lifton, it's Tofel, even though you're not actually using it l'lachbes as a pass. Then we have the tzad of the other tzad of the Pri Megadim, that it's what Rav Shlomo calls a super bracha. Bracha patters, another understanding in Rav Papa. The third tzad is what seems to be evident from the Rishonim, and we see in the Beis Meir that there's something called everything included in Suda. So to summarize, we have three possibilities in understanding this din. So I apologize, we didn't reach the we won't have time to see the Magen Geburim in this limud. Lineda will see it in the next limud. But here we can test ourselves on Perek KEITZAD MEVARCHIM. Kommt der Eben Oizer and sagt, Rabbi say, we forgot the Tosfos. It's a Tosfos we learned. We spent time learning this Tosfos. It's true, it's not in the sugya of Dharma Bo Mesech Suda. It's a Tosfos in the sugya Pasabal Bekisnim. But Tosfos on Daf Lamed Ches discusses, page 7 of the Maramakoimus, Tosfos discusses a case of Nilish. A case of Nilish. Nilish is a kind of is a sort of a dough wrapped, a masa wrapped in dough. V'chein Nilish. Ikova sudose alei mevarach aleim hamoitzi. V'chein tziva haram b'purim shekovim sudos aleim mevarach hamoitzi. It's sort of a krepel. So Tosfos first brings, if you're kover suda mevarach hamoitzi, then Tosfos brings a psak of the ram. That what b'purim shekovim sudos aleim. Even though on Purim, that was the main part of the Suda, he instructed them to do the following. Levarech hamoitzi bepas tchila kedei lepoitra mibracha shahoya mesupik im habe kviyosai kviyosai loy. He wasn't sure if the kviyos of Nilish is an adequate kviyos. So what did he say they should do? He said they should make the bracha pass first. So the Even Oizer, was steht da on Tosfos? The Metzias was, that was the main dish of the Suda. Just the ram was masupuk, if that's enough of a kviyos. Can you know there are other things with it? So what was the ram's eitzah? So make moitzi. Now, were they kaver on that moitzi? What were they kaver on that moitzi? Or rather not. So Zot Even knows it's in Frush Tosfos. The Magen Avraham is masupuk. Again, if one eats a small amount of pas, that you're not being kaver la pas. Can the pas patter? Zot the Pri Megadim, what's the suffix? If we need the din of Iker and Tofel, the pas is not the Iker. If the mere fact of making birchas hamoitzi includes in it the bracha of everything else, then you made the bracha of hamoitzi faktish. Zot the Even knows it's a Tosfos. What we always call, so if we have a suffix in brachas, you say, okay, wash a little bit and make a hamoitzi. It's a Tosfos. And Tosfos is clearly describing a case where the kviyos didn't change, they didn't fill themselves on pas. It was the same suda, just he said, Rabbi said, before you eat the Nilish. Zog the Even Oizer, the Magen Avraham, the Chayr is a Tosfos. It's a Tosfos. It's a Tosfos.
The question, what might see out? You're asking a different question. What are you going to do about it?
So we'll just finish with this chiddush of the Magen Geburim, and B'leis Hashem and B'linei, in the next limud will expand on this Magen Geburim further. So the Magen Geburim, the kash of the Even Oizer the Rav of the Even Oizer has no place b'chlal. Why? Because he says, Rabbi said, there's an assumption that we made in the sugya that's not correct. He says like this. The whole sugya of Dvarim Aboim B'Seicha Suda Machmas Asuda, Zot the Balamar, is what's the case? You wash them pass, and they're serving you dish after dish. You b'shas that you made the bracha on the pass. Had in mind clearly that the bracha on the pass was going to apply to everything I was going to eat in the Suda. What state in Balamar? In that case, it's poshut that the bracha on the pass applies to everything. So Memele Zok the Even Oizer, I have a raya from a Tosis that the Ram gave them the eitzah to make moitzi. Of course it works, because our whole sugya of Dvarim Aboim Machmas Asuda is where you didn't have specifically in mind where you made the bracha of hamoitzi, what's going to be brought later in the Suda. But where you had in mind on the bracha of hamoitzi to pater everything that's in the Suda, it applies to absolutely everything. Memele, the eitzah of the Ram was take a piece of pass, make birchas hamoitzi, and have in mind the nilish, have in mind the krepel. Of course that works. So Zot the Mogen Giborim, our whole sugya is not whether or not Dvarim Haboim B'Toich HaSuda, Machmas HaSuda, Shaloi Machmas HaSuda can or can't include something that's not lifton, something that's daisa. That's only if that's the stoma, and therefore we have a question: what's included in the Seder of the Suda? But where you had specific das, of course it includes. Memela, the eitzah that we use, which is the nofitz to use based on this thesis of making hamoitzi kidei to absolve everything else of bracha, of course works, because your das was specifically that it should apply to that. So Memela, we've opened up in the Mogen Giborim a new facet in the sugya that really isn't readily evident from the Rishonim. And B'lineda in the next thing we'll come back to it, and we'll see a Nakuda in Igris Moshe, which will be very negel halacha based on this nidin. But the Mogen Giborim has now told us that we've made an assumption in the sugya that's unfounded. The sugya is not to what extent birchas hapas can include other things. That's only in a case of the Mogen Giborim where I didn't have das and it's a stoma, and then there's a question: what does birchas hapas include? But when my das was that birchas hapas should include everything, then avada it includes everything, and we'll Be'ez Hashem and B'lineda in the next limud discuss the raya of the Mogen Giborim from a Rashba later on in birchas hapas potar safar peres. So to summarize, we have now at the end of the sugya, as we often conclude our limudim Be'ez Hashem, with three different approaches to understand this basic din. We have the Mogen Avram that remains with Iker and Tofel, not just in Rashi, but even in Tosfos, that the sugya fundamentally mirrors the dinim of Iker and Tofel. And therefore, when one's Iker das isn't to be kaveh ala pas, and the pas is not the Iker of the Suda, the entire sugya doesn't apply. Das ha-Mogen Avram. We have the other tzad of the Mogen Avram, as the Pri Megadim explains, and in a new concept, that somehow the bracha of hamoitzi is a bracha chashuva, which memela patters everything from a bracha if all those dvarim are somehow a sequence related to the past. The third tzad, which we seem to establish mitoch the Rashba, the Balamor, and the Beis Meir, is that there's a concept of what Rashi is calling tofel in the sugya, which is that everything included in the Seder of a Suda is automatically part of the Birchas HaPas, and that's the basis of Rashi's logic of why all mashkim are included in the Birchas HaPas. And Be'ez Hashem and B'lineder in next week's limud, we will continue with the last point, which we ended with the Mogen Giborim, that qualifies that our sugya is only speaking about what is included in the Birchas HaPas b'stoma, but if there's specific das, then the sugya doesn't apply b'chlal. And Be'ez Hashem and B'lineder will see further the Mogen Giborim's rayas and the Igros Moshe.
Cover the yesh something, a fruit soup or fruit salad should not be included. Why not? Point to all three of those explanations to Rav gave, which is the kapatu.
Yeah. So
part of the
yeah.
Part of the Iker,
So yeah. So Be'ez Hashem and B'lineder, I mentioned at the beginning, the Mukarab Sif Beis is Rabbeinu Yoino, which is the third mahalach in Shittas Rashi, and based on it's entirely it's a different mahalach in the sugya. And B'lineder, as I said, we will be oisik in that in the next limud. Okay. Just to finish with Divrei Agoda. We're familiar with the sugya in Sanhedrin on the Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph, where the Gemara describes the exchange between various Umas Ha'olam and Alexandrus Moikdain, where the fact that Alexandrus Moikdain had occupied Eretz Yisrael and was then in the lashon of the Gemara Megillah was a Moshel Bekipa, he ruled the civilized world. So various Umas Olam seized the opportunity of the establishment of the authority of Alexander's Moikdain to come to him with various tainas, various grievances against what Klal Yisrael had done through history. And the Gemara brings a number of mice. And the first brisa the Gemara brings is Tonu Rabbanon, the Gemara brisa says, Be'esrim va'arba b'Nisan isnatilu dimusnoi mi Yehuda mi Yerushalayim. On the 24th of Nisan, these complaints, these were removed. Lashon of Rashi is oirin bali chamos shoyroitz a little chelik b'Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. Those who came to be ma'oira that they wanted a part of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, their claims were dismissed. If you look on the side of the Gemara, there's a girsa from the Seder Olam that didn't happen on the Esrim v'Arba b'Nisan, but it happened when? It happened on the Esrim v'Chamisha of Sivan. So if we go with the girsa of the Seder Olam, this is in Yana the Yaimu, the sugya in Sanhedrin. This is the girsa is brought on the Gilin of the Gemara that in Megillas Tainis the girsa is Sivan and it's be'esrim v'chamisha bei. As I state in Seder Olam. So we'll focus perhaps on one of the Tainis. So the first one is Kshabo b'nei Afrikia. Those who are the inhabitants of Africa. Lodun Yisrael lifnei Alexander's Mokdai. This is on the Tzadik Aleph from Dalef and Sanhedrin. Omru loy Eretz Canaan shalonuhi. Eretz Canaan is ours. Why? Tichsiv Eretz Canaan l'gvulei Yisrael. The Torah describes the land Eretz Yisrael as Eretz Canaan. U'Canaan avu and the Hana Inshe have. Canaan is the progenitor of the Bnei Africa. So therefore, Eretz
Yisrael. Put up the Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's worth it.
Yeah. So that was their taina. So Omerlu Gvir ben Psisa l'Chachamim, he said, Tnuli Rishus ve'elech va'odani moim lifnei Alexander's Moikdain. I want to go and defend Klal Yisrael. So what did he say to them? He said, Mehechon atem meviim raya. Where's your proof that you have a claim to Eretz Yisrael? Omru loy min ha-Torah. It's a pasuk in Chumash. We just said it. Omar lohem afani lo yovilem raya el min ha-Torah. I'll bring you a proof from the Torah. Shenemar vayomer. Right? Noach said, Or Canaan, Eved Avodim Yela Echov, Eved Shekono Nechosim. An Eved who takes possession of an item. Eved Lemi v'Nechosim Lemi. So what an Eved takes possession of, what's called in the Lashon of Chazal, Mashakono Eved Kono Rabbi. In short, it's Eved, it's Eretz Canaan, but you as Avodim were in possession of it, and therefore it belongs to us. That's the Oid Elashari Kamoshonim Shalai Avadatonu. So Alexander's Mokdan, the Gemara says, gave them 3 days to form a response, to formulate a response. They found no response and they abandoned their claim. That was the first Masumatan that the Gemara brings. Now, L'chura, this Gemara is a Tzarachim. This issue of the Umas Olam coming to challenge Klal Yisrael's sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael, we're familiar with, is the first Rashi in Chumash. Amr Yitzchak. Lama Schila Torah should have started. Shem Yovo Umas Olam v'Yomru listim atem. So we'll say, the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Bayrei. But who not Lamichem v'Nos Nalonu? The answer of Givir ben Pesisi should have been Bereshis bara Elokim. It's the Rebbeinu Shalom, and the Rebbeinu Shalom gave it to us. That seems to be the answer which Rashi says the Torah Kedosha prepared in order to fend off any tainus. So what's the Masumatan here? We have a tshuva nitzachas, which Chazal say is the tshuva.
Why we're not using that tshuva?
Correct. And monoshach, if they're maimin in Torah, then the claim is the claim. So if we are medayik and the Yesod Advarim is mavur in the Maharsha and Chiddushei Haggadah, we'll just expand on it. We know that there were earlier claims to to places that Klal Yisrael conquered in the end of Sefer Shoftim. We have the Milchama that the Bnei Amoin came and claimed Eva Hayarden, Milchama with Yiftach. So the question then is, why did the Bnei Africa wait until Alexander's Moikdain? Claims to Eretz Yisrael could have been made immediately. What was the reason why the Bnei Africa waited? If we perhaps you could even ask a further shaila, that means Eretz Yisrael lied Shemim for 70 years. The Bnei Africa had ample opportunity to come back and reconquer Eretz Yisrael. What was the reason why they were waiting until the Zman of Alexander's Mokdain to come and present their tainus? What's mavur in the Gemara, and they say that Dvarim is the Mashon Chidush Haggadah, as we said, we'll be marchib es Dvarim. Rashi's lashon is that Bnei Africa Lodun, what did they want? So you wrote in little chelek Yehuda of Yerushalayim. Rashi doesn't say that they wanted to wrest control of Eretz Yisrael away from Klal Yisrael. They wanted to have a chelek Yehuda of Yerushalayim. What does that mean? L'chura, what it means is similar to the Umas Ha'olam that wanted to build a Beis HaMikdash together with Klal Yisrael. That the Umas Ha'olam no longer wanted to be excluded from everything that Eretz Yisrael and the Makam HaMikdash represented. So their taina was the following: Ein chanami bizman bayis rishon. When Klal Yisrael was b'tifartom, and Klal Yisrael were the shleimim and at the complete madrega, the binyan of Shloimoi and Kibush Eretz Yisrael b'shleimus, the Umas Ha'olam understood that to that gedula of Klal Yisrael that they didn't have a chelik. And so too, Bisman Golus Bavel, they understood if Klal Yisrael would return to Eretz Yisrael and regain the former glory of what they were, like the Gemara says in Yoma, Im Alisam Kachayma, then there would be Nisim Ki Yitzias Mitzrayim. But when Alexander's Mokdan came and re-established the sovereignty of Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael finally, and he recognized Shimon HaTzadik as the ultimate authority over Klal Yisrael, dismissed, as the Gemara says, the Shamroin and the Tzdukim, and established the Kutim, and established the Memshala of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. So the Umas Ha'olam looked and saw this is not the Shleimus of Klal Yisrael. The Beis HaMikdash is Chaser Chamisha Dvarim. There's something called Mokum Shekovshu Oile Bavel that was far smaller than the area Shekovshu Oile Mitzrayim. This is already not Klal Yisrael anymore. This isn't the Shleimus of Klal Yisrael. If this isn't the Shleimus of Klal Yisrael, we're eligible to have a chelik too. What was Eretz Yisrael Nitan for? Eretz Yisrael was Nitan for Klal Yisrael b'Shleimus. But now that Klal Yisrael was Nizgarish me'artzom, and they didn't have Nisam ki Yetzi Mitzrayim when they returned, and Chamisha Dvarim Chaser and Bayis Sheni, so Ebazai, the Umas Ha'olam came and said, we're reasserting our authority. To who was Eretz Yisrael Nitan? If Klal Yisrael would be b'Shleimusam, they'd be Megarish the Goyim Hashem Mipneiim. But Labasoif, why would Klal Yisrael be Goyle? Klal Yisrael will be Goyle because Klal Yisrael would know from Imagigosam. So Ebazoi, the Tvi of the Umas Ha'olam, says Rashi, is that we want a chelik in Eretz Yisrael. We no longer deserve to be excluded. To that, the answer of Gvir ben Pesisa was that it's been relinquished forever. There isn't a right because Masha Kono Evet, Kono Rabbi, Canaan was nidche from having a chelik in Eretz Yisrael. There's a different reason why Canaan was nidche. But B'Yisoida, their taina was that we're eligible for Eretz Yisrael. We're eligible to have a chelik. So we now understand why we can't invoke, why Gvir ben Pesisa couldn't invoke the Rashi in Parashas Bereshis that Bereshusoi not lamichem v'nosna alonu. When would that be? The Bereshusoi not lamichem v'nosna alonu, not only was in Klal Yisrael, was Oilam and Mitzrayim, and there was Zeichat Etzrol. Of course, the Rebbeinu Shalom took it Bereshus v'not lamichem v'nosna alonu. But that's only as long as the conditions and the matzah of Klal Yisrael was b'shleimus. But now Gvir ben Pesisa realized that they have a different taina. They have a taina that now that Alexander's Moktan has re-established the Shimon ben Tzadik. Klal Yisrael was Chaser a Melech. Klal Yisrael was about to be Chaser Neviim. Klal Yisrael was Chaser the Chamisha Dvarim. The kibush of Oile Bovel was a much less of a scale than the kibush of Oile Mitzrayim. So that's not the original intent of kibush Yisrael. We want the chelik. What then was Rashi says that why is this brought in Megillas Tainis? Because Rashi says, these are the Megillas Tainis choshev kol oison yom shenasa bam nisan lisrael v'kovim yomtev. It's a yomtev mishum neis zeh. The neis that they were menatzech the umas ha'olam. What was the neis? So of course, the neis was the fact is that Alexander Smokton accepted, but the oimek of the neis is that it's mavur. We see in Chazal that the Yisoida there would have been a taina. Klal Yisrael's achizah on Eretz Yisrael was scarce compared to the shleimus of being zeich in Eretz Yisrael. The neis was that the hashgacha was showing Klal Yisrael that they still maintain that same achizah on Eretz Yisrael, that same seder of Rishusay, not lemechem and asal eino chenami. Those like it's Mavura and the Novi who saw the Bayis Sheni were boicha leumas the Tiferes of the Bayis of the Rishon, and the kibush of Eretz Yisrael was so much more inferior than the kibush of the second time. But Lemaisa, the nace was that Kanira Klal Yisrael didn't lose their Maila, and the Goyim still don't have a chelik v'nachla b'toich Yisrael. That was the nace of the Yom Chachei of Sivan, as is Mavur in Megillas Tainis. Perhaps could I just to be Moisef, that this same oira of hashgacha that we were zeicha to, that's mavura in the Gemara, has a similar echo in the Meshech Chochma in Dvarim. Explains the fourth bracha of Birchas Hamazon, which was nikva. The Gemara says in brachas because of when Harugei Beita were brought l'kvura. So Mei Simcha asks, is that an ace of such significance, a chesed of such significance, and va'oid, why is that part of Birchas Hamazon? Why is that ace of part of the Seder Birchas Hamazon? Zoter Mei Simcha, the reason for that is because the whole bracha of Birchas Hamazon seems to also include in it things which are not directly shaykh to Birchas Hamazon. Noida L'cha includes bris, it includes Torah. The Yesod HaDvarim is that the bracha of Birchas Hamazon was nikva for the chasodim of the Rebbeinu Shalom and for the hashgacha of how the Rebbeinu Shalom is mated with Klal Yisrael. Zoter Mei Simcha, imagine the state, we'll be marchiv a little, but imagine the state of Klal Yisrael after the Bar Kochva the merit of Bar Kochva was crushed. Harei Rebbe Kiva noise kelev hayan, he thought Bar Kochva was Mashiach. Klal Yisrael expected that this would throw off the dominion of the Roimiyim and lead to Klal Yisrael to be as Mashiach. And then it was crushed, and not just it was crushed, but for months, the Mason, the Pegorim of Beitar were left without even Kvura. And then the Rebbeinu Shalom was Merachim, and then we brought the Kvura. Zoter Mei Simcha, what Chazal saw in that is that not just that the Rebbeinu Shalom ki lo yitosh Hashem amoy, and even in the case where Klal Yisrael were in Eretz Yisrael, under the domination of the Roimiyim, crushed, having lost now the clarity of what the Gula Asida would even be. Right? Oidialu asobim al kivrcha akiva v'adayin ben David loibo, in the lashon of the Gemara in Chelek. Chachmei Yisrael were chelek in Rebbe Kiva in this nekuda. It has very broad ramifications when you get to Ikrei Emunah, as the Rambam and the Raiva discussed in Hilchos Tshuva. But the Yesod HaDvarim is the Meir Simcha, the Rebbeinu Shalom advised that then also the Rebbeinu Shalom is Merachem and Mashgiach, and Labasoif the Harugei Beita were brought the Kvura. Therefore, that belongs in the bracha of Birchas Hamazon, because the bracha of Birchas Hamazon describes not just the chesed of the Rebbeinu Shalom when we have Eretz Yisrael b'shleimus, and we have a mikdash, noida lecha, rachemno, not just binyan haaretz and binyan hamikdash, but even after our achizah on Eretz Yisrael is so tenuous, but still the Rebbeinu Shalom is merachem to show Klal Yisrael chasad of mitoich tzara. That merited the kvius of a fourth bracha in Birchas Hamazon. Dvar niflaim in Remei Simcha. Mimele Birchas Hamazon we know was nisakin by Moshe in the Midbar. Then Yeshua was Mosif and they were nichnas la'aretz, and then Binyan Yerushalayim they were Mosif further. All of Birchas Hamazon essentially is a bracha for Oretz, which symbolizes the way the Rebbeinu Shalom is mashbiach has the v'tuvah. And there are times in which Klal Yisrael, the achiz on Eretz Yisrael, is very tenuous, and therefore Adarabba roitzim little chelek b'Yehuda Yerushalayim, and the Umas Ha'olam then come and then try and denigrate that miyuchodus that Eretz Yisrael has to Klal Yisrael. That was the nace of the Yom Chofei of Sivan, that Gvir ben Besisa was in Menatzeach, that the Umas Oilam remain Eved La'echov, Mashe Kono Eved Kono Rabbi. They won't have a Chelek in Eretz Yisrael. And that in Birchas HaMazon has its reflection also, that even though we're Moida on Oretz, Bris, Torah, Mikdosh, but the bracha revius that was left to Chazal to Misakim was to show that even Bisman that we see seemingly so weit, but nonetheless the Rebbeinu Shem is Merachim, the Rebbeinu Shem is Mashpia, and for that the bracha revius was Misakim.